Ladies and gentlemen, the conversation around XRP in 2026 is no longer about wild speculation or overnight miracles. It is about maturity, realism, and where this asset truly fits in a rapidly evolving global financial system. And that shift in perspective is exactly why this topic matters right now. As the crypto market moves out of its experimental phase and deeper into real-world integration, expectations are being reset. Narratives are being challenged, and investors are beginning to ask more disciplined questions about value, timing, and long-term positioning. To understand any realistic price forecast for XRP in 2026, we first need to acknowledge how different the market environment has become compared to previous cycles. Earlier bull runs were driven largely by retail enthusiasm, loose liquidity, and hype-driven narratives that rewarded speed more than patience. Today, the crypto space is increasingly shaped by regulation, institutional frameworks, and infrastructure-level adoption. That transition fundamentally changes how price appreciation happens. It becomes slower, more deliberate, and more closely tied to actual usage rather than social media momentum. XRP sits at a very specific intersection in this environment. It is not competing to be digital gold, nor is it trying to replace smart contract platforms. Its value proposition has always centered on efficiency in payments, liquidity management, and cross-border settlement. As we look ahead to 2026, the key question is not whether XRP can generate attention, but whether it can continue to embed itself into financial plumbing that most people never see but rely on every day. When assets move from speculation into infrastructure, price behavior changes in important ways. Another critical factor shaping realistic expectations is market maturity. As crypto assets age, their volatility profile evolves. Explosive percentage gains become harder, but sustained value creation becomes more credible. For XRP, this means that future price movement is more likely to reflect adoption milestones, network utility, and macroeconomic conditions rather than short-term excitement. That may sound less thrilling, but for serious investors and long-term observers, it is actually a sign of growing legitimacy. It is also important to recognize that 2026 sits far enough ahead to allow structural developments to play out, but close enough that assumptions must remain grounded. Forecasting is not about predicting exact numbers. It is about mapping scenarios, understanding constraints, and identifying what would need to happen for certain outcomes to become plausible. In this discussion, we are not chasing maximum upside fantasies. We are defining reasonable ranges based on evidence, trend lines, and market behavior. Respected viewers, when we talk about realistic expectations for XRP in 2026, everything begins with the fundamental drivers that actually move price over time. Not headlines, not rumors, but structural forces that persist whether the market is excited or fearful. The first of these drivers is adoption, not in the abstract sense, but in the very specific context of how financial institutions use digital assets to solve real problems. XRP's long-term relevance is tied to whether it continues to be positioned as a liquidity tool rather than a speculative instrument, and that distinction matters deeply for forecasting. Cross-border payments remain one of the most inefficient areas of the global financial system. Settlement delays, high fees, and trapped liquidity are not theoretical issues. They are daily operational costs for banks, payment providers, and multinational businesses. XRP was designed to address these inefficiencies, and as financial systems modernize, the demand for faster and cheaper settlement mechanisms grows naturally. If this demand continues to translate into sustained transactional usage, it creates a baseline of utility-driven demand that supports price over time. Another important driver is regulatory clarity. Markets do not thrive on uncertainty, especially when institutional capital is involved. By 2026, the crypto industry is likely to be operating in a far more defined regulatory environment than it has in the past. This does not necessarily mean less innovation, but it does mean clearer rules of engagement. For XRP, regulatory resolution and clarity can remove long-standing overhangs that previously limited participation. When risk becomes measurable, capital becomes more comfortable. Liquidity dynamics also deserve careful attention. XRP's supply structure, circulation, and release mechanisms influence how price responds to demand. Unlike assets with rapidly changing issuance schedules, XRP operates within a known framework, which allows the market to model future supply more accurately. This predictability reduces shock risk, but also limits sudden scarcity narratives. As a result, price appreciation tends to follow steady demand growth rather than abrupt squeezes. Macro conditions cannot be ignored either. By 2026, global markets may be navigating a very different interest rate environment, monetary policy stance, and geopolitical landscape than today. Digital assets do not exist in isolation. They react to liquidity cycles, risk appetite, and capital flows across asset classes. XRP's performance will be influenced not only by its own progress, but by how attractive alternative investments appear at the same time. What all of this tells us is that XRP's path toward 2026 is shaped less by hype and more by alignment. Alignment between technology and use case, between regulation and participation, and between market expectations and actual delivery. In the next part, we will translate these drivers into realistic price scenarios, exploring what conservative, moderate, and optimistic outcomes might look like without exaggeration or false certainty. Let me be very clear. When we move from drivers into price scenarios, the goal is not to impress with bold numbers, but to understand what different futures would reasonably imply for XRP's valuation by 2026. A realistic forecast works in ranges shaped by conditions, not in single-point predictions that ignore uncertainty. With that in mind, it helps to think in three broad scenarios that reflect how adoption, regulation, and market sentiment could realistically unfold over the next couple of years. In a more conservative scenario, XRP continues to exist as a functional asset, but without a dramatic expansion in usage or narrative dominance. Adoption grows gradually. Regulatory clarity improves, but does not trigger a major influx of new capital, and the broader crypto market experiences moderate cycles rather than explosive growth. In this environment, XRP's price would likely reflect steady participation rather than speculation. Appreciation would come from incremental demand and reduced uncertainty, not from sudden excitement. This scenario favors stability over spectacle and aligns with a maturing asset finding its place rather than redefining the market. A moderate scenario assumes a more balanced outcome, where XRP benefits from clearer regulation, expanding institutional comfort, and measurable growth in transaction-related usage. Here, the asset is no longer weighed down by persistent doubt, and it begins to be evaluated more seriously as part of payment and liquidity strategies. In this case, price movement becomes more responsive to fundamentals, and market confidence builds gradually. Gains are meaningful but measured, driven by progress rather than promises. This is often the scenario long-term investors quietly hope for, because it combines credibility with upside. An optimistic scenario, while still grounded in realism, assumes stronger than expected alignment across several fronts. Regulatory clarity arrives sooner and more decisively, institutional adoption accelerates, and macro conditions support risk assets without excessive volatility. Under these circumstances, XRP could experience a re-rating, not because of hype, but because its role becomes clearer and more valued within financial infrastructure. Even here, however, growth would likely unfold over time rather than in a single dramatic surge. Markets reward consistency, not just breakthroughs. What is important to understand is that even the most optimistic realistic scenario does not rely on XRP becoming something it was never designed to be. It does not require it to dominate every sector of crypto or replace entire systems overnight. Instead, it assumes execution, relevance, and patience. Price follows function, and function follows adoption. In the next part, we will tie these scenarios together by discussing expectations, common misconceptions, and how viewers should think about XRP as 2026 approaches, including how to frame risk, time horizons, and decision-making. Respected viewers, as we bring these scenarios together, it becomes clear that one of the biggest challenges facing XRP investors heading into 2026 is not lack of information, but misaligned expectations. Many market participants are still conditioned by past cycles to look for explosive moves disconnected from fundamentals, while the market itself is evolving towards something far more structured and disciplined. Understanding this shift is essential for making sense of where XRP realistically fits in the coming years. A common misconception is that utility alone guarantees dramatic price appreciation. Utility matters, but it works slowly. Infrastructure assets tend to appreciate as they become reliable, trusted, and deeply embedded, not as they generate excitement. This means progress can be happening even when price action feels underwhelming in the short term. By 2026, XRP's success is more likely to be measured by consistency of use, integration depth, and institutional comfort rather than viral moments. Another important point is time horizon. XRP is not a momentum trade by design, it is a positioning asset. Those evaluating its future need to be honest about what they are seeking. If the goal is short-term volatility, there will always be assets better suited for that purpose. If the goal is exposure to a potential long-term shift in how value moves across borders, then patience becomes part of the strategy. Markets reward alignment between expectations and reality and punish those who confuse the two. Risk framing is equally critical. Even with clearer regulation and growing adoption, XRP remains a crypto asset, subject to broader market cycles and external shocks. A realistic outlook does not eliminate downside scenarios, it contextualizes them. The strength of a forecast lies not in optimism or pessimism, but in preparedness. Understanding what could go wrong is just as important as understanding what could go right. As 2026 approaches, the most grounded approach is to view XRP not as a bet on headlines, but as a thesis on evolution. An evolution of payments, of financial infrastructure, and of how digital assets coexist with traditional systems. That thesis may not deliver instant gratification, but it offers something far more valuable to serious observers: coherence. If you have found this perspective useful, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts or questions in the comments, because thoughtful discussion is how clarity spreads in a market often dominated by noise.